Empires don't collapse in an instant. They rot from within, slowly at first, decay hidden beneath the surface, until one day the foundation gives way. The United States has spent decades building an economic system that, for better or worse, became the backbone of global trade, finance, and stability. The dollar became the world's currency. American markets set the tempo for the rest of the world. Its economic alliances, its debts, even its reckless spending, none of it seemed to matter because the system worked. Until now. What happens when that system breaks? When the country that built globalization decides to tear it apart? Donald Trump is not the first president to challenge the world order. He may be the last to oversee its unmaking. His policies, tariffs, trade wars, fiscal recklessness aren't just momentary disruptions. They are the accelerants to a fire that has been smoldering for years. And in a worst-case scenario, this fire doesn't just burn down the American economy, it takes the entire global system with it. But here's the thing about collapse. It's not always obvious when it begins. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as a broken alliance, a tariff, a bond sell-off, a quiet moment in history that, in hindsight, will look like the turning point. And we may already be there. Welcome to our channel, where we break down the forces driving our global economy, from the history of major companies to today's shifting trends. We're here to make complex topics clear and relevant. Chapter 1. The End of Globalization. Globalization was never just about trade. It was about power. For decades, the United States sat at the center of a vast economic web, dictating the rules of global commerce. Trade agreements ensured American access to foreign markets. The dollar became the foundation of international finance. The world's largest economies depended on the stable relations with Washington to keep the system running. That system is now coming apart. Donald Trump's return to power has accelerated a shift that was already underway, the unraveling of American globalization. His administration isn't just reviving past trade wars, it's escalating them. One of Trump's first major moves was reinstating and expanding tariffs, targeting China, the European Union, and even traditional allies like Japan and South Korea. The logic? Protect American industry. The reality? A global economic realignment that pushes the U.S. further into isolation. China has doubled down on alternative trade routes. Instead of negotiating with Washington, Beijing is strengthening its Belt and Road Initiative, solidifying economic ties with Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Without U.S. involvement, the EU is shifting away from American leadership. European policymakers, wary of Trump's unpredictability, are finalizing trade agreements with Asia and Latin America to secure supply chains that bypass U.S. influence. BRICS nations are accelerating de-dollarization. Russia, India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia are moving toward regional currencies, making the dollar less necessary for global transactions. In short, global markets are adapting, and America is losing leverage. Trump's policies operate on the assumption that America's market is irreplaceable, that foreign nations will always return to the negotiating table, that they need the U.S. more than the U.S. needs them. But what if that's no longer true? American exporters are already feeling the impact. Retaliatory tariffs from China and the EU have slashed demand for U.S. goods. Supply chains are shifting permanently. After years of trade tensions, companies are restructuring operations to avoid reliance on American suppliers. The dollar's dominance is eroding. Central banks in major economies are stockpiling reserves in alternative currencies to avoid dependence on U.S. monetary policy. Trump's first term showed the world that America's commitment to globalization could be reversed overnight. His second term is proving that the reversal is permanent. For decades, American economic supremacy was built on one assumption, that no major economy could function without the U.S. at the table. That assumption is now collapsing. With every new tariff, every broken trade deal, every diplomatic rift, the U.S. is making itself less central to global commerce. The question is no longer whether globalization is ending, but whether America will still have a seat in whatever comes next. And as the world moves forward, Washington may find itself watching from the sidelines. Chapter 2, The Tariff Trap, a nation at war with itself. Trade wars don't start with explosions. They start with paperwork, tariffs, retaliations, economic walls rising between nations. And right now, the United States is building those walls higher than ever. Donald Trump's return to power has reignited his trade war strategy. But this time, he's going further. Instead of selective tariffs aimed at China, he's pushing for across-the-board import taxes, a 10% universal tariff on everything entering the U.S., with even higher penalties on goods from key rivals. The goal? To force American companies to bring jobs back home. The reality? A self-inflicted economic war that punishes the very industries it claims to protect. On paper, tariffs are supposed to make foreign goods more expensive, giving U.S. companies an edge. But in practice, modern economies don't work that way. Everything is interconnected. Manufacturers rely on global supply chains. The raw materials, components, and electronics that power American factories don't come from thin air. They're imported. Now those costs are skyrocketing. Consumers bear the brunt. A 10% import tax doesn't just hurt businesses. It drives up prices on everything from cars to groceries to medicine. Inflation that was once cooling is now surging again. Farmers are facing the consequences. After years of trade tensions, key buyers like China have shifted their agricultural imports elsewhere. U.S. soybean exports never fully recovered from Trump's first trade war. A second one? It could be the breaking point. This isn't a theory, it's happening right now. Auto manufacturers are warning that rising steel and aluminum costs will force them to cut jobs. Retailers are preparing for price hikes that could hit consumers by the next holiday season. And foreign trade partners? They aren't waiting to see what happens. Trade wars don't happen in a vacuum. Other countries fight back. China has reimposed tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, further cutting off American farmers from their biggest market. The European Union is targeting U.S. industries that depend on exports, including aviation and tech. Japan and South Korea are forging stronger trade agreements with the EU and China, creating economic ties that reduce their reliance on the U.S. And here's the dangerous part. This isn't just tit-for-tat retaliation. It's a long-term shift away from American trade dominance. The last time Trump launched a tariff war, he eventually bailed out American farmers with billions in government aid. But now the situation is different. The U.S. national debt is higher than ever. Interest rates are climbing, and Washington is running out of fiscal room to cushion the damage. This time, there may be no bailout big enough to undo the damage. Corporate layoffs are already being announced as industries face higher costs. U.S. exports are shrinking as trading partners shift to other suppliers. Inflation is being reignited as import prices surge across essential goods. Trump's economic nationalism frames tariffs as a weapon to bring back American jobs. But in a world of deeply interconnected economies, protectionism doesn't just punish foreign competitors. It cripples domestic industries too. And here's the worst part. The world has options. If American goods become too expensive, buyers will go elsewhere. If American companies can't compete globally, they will shrink or move overseas. And once those shifts happen, they don't reverse overnight. They become permanent. History has already taught us this lesson. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 was designed to protect American industries. Instead, it triggered a global trade collapse and deepened the Great Depression. We're watching history repeat itself, and this time, the world may not be waiting for America to recover. Chapter 3. The Debt Spiral, America's Point of No Return. For years, America's debt was treated like an abstract problem, something economists debated, something politicians ignored. Now, it's a ticking time bomb. And under Donald Trump's second administration, that bomb is counting down faster than ever. Tax cuts will be expanded, benefiting the ultra-rich. Tariffs are reducing government revenue instead of increasing it. And all of this is happening while the U.S. is already drowning in debt. When Trump left office in 2021, the national debt had jumped by $7.8 trillion, the largest increase in history. Today, the U.S. debt has passed 120% of GDP, a point where most economies enter a danger zone. That means America now owes more than it produces in an entire year. The government is paying over $1 billion per day in interest alone. And with interest rates high, that cost is only growing. The more the U.S. borrows, the more it must pay to keep borrowing. It's a cycle that feeds itself. Trump has made it clear he wants more tax cuts. But with debt already at historic highs, slashing revenue will only widen the deficit. He wants massive infrastructure projects. Where will the funding come from? More borrowing. He's considering tariffs as a revenue source. But tariffs shrink the economy, meaning the government ultimately collects less. The problem isn't just the numbers, it's the lack of a plan. Trump isn't cutting spending. He isn't reducing deficits. He's doubling down on the same policies that sent debt skyrocketing in his first term. Only now the U.S. has far less room to maneuver. For decades, the U.S. has run massive deficits without immediate consequences because the world was willing to keep lending. But that trust is eroding. China has been quietly reducing its U.S. Treasury holdings. Japan, once the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt, is looking for alternatives. Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich nations are investing more in gold and foreign currencies. The message is clear. America's creditors are losing confidence. If global investors start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for the risk, borrowing costs will explode. The government will have no choice but to cut spending, raise taxes, or print more money to cover the gap. And if the U.S. starts printing money to finance its debt, that's when the real crisis begins. Trump has already floated the idea. You never have to default because you print the money. That statement should terrify anyone who understands economics. Printing money to cover debt doesn't solve the problem. It destroys confidence in the currency. And once that confidence is gone, there's no getting it back. The result? The dollar weakens. Imported goods become unaffordable. Inflation spirals out of control. We've seen this before, not in America, but in countries like Argentina, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Nations that spent beyond their means, printed money to survive, and collapsed under hyperinflation. America was never supposed to be one of those countries, but debt doesn't disappear just because people stop paying attention to it. Every empire in history has faced this moment, the choice between fiscal discipline or economic catastrophe. Rome debased its currency to finance endless wars. The British Empire accumulated unsustainable debt before its global influence collapsed. The Soviet Union spent itself into ruin trying to outpace the U.S. military. And now America is following the same trajectory. If Washington doesn't change course, if Trump continues spending without limits, borrowing without restraint, then the U.S. is heading for the same fate. Because debt crises don't happen gradually, they happen suddenly. One day everything seems fine. The next investors panic, interest rates spike, the government scrambles to reassure markets. And then, before anyone fully realizes what's happening, the entire system starts to break. The U.S. isn't immune to economic collapse. No empire ever is. The only question left is, how much time is left before the reckoning? Chapter 4. The Death of the Dollar. The collapse no one thought possible. For nearly a century, the U.S. dollar has been the backbone of the global economy. Every major nation holds it in reserves. Oil, commodities, and global trade are settled in it. The dollar isn't just America's currency, it's the world's. But under Trump's second administration, that dominance is slipping faster than ever. Even before Trump's return, the world had been slowly diversifying away from the dollar. But his policies, escalating trade wars, aggressive tariffs, economic nationalism, are accelerating the process. China and Russia have already cut their reliance on the dollar. Trade between the two nations is now settled in yuan and rubles. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively working on an alternative reserve currency. Saudi Arabia, once a cornerstone of the petrodollar system, is now accepting oil payments in yuan. These shifts aren't happening in secret. They are public, deliberate, and growing. The strength of the U.S. dollar is based on one thing: trust. The world trusts that America will pay its debts, keep inflation under control, and remain a stable economic leader. But Trump's policies are undermining that trust. Massive deficit spending is raising fears about the U.S. government's ability to manage its finances. Tariffs and trade wars are making global markets less reliant on the dollar. A politically weakened Federal Reserve is facing pressure to print more money, risking inflation and instability. If major economies begin dumping U.S. treasuries, demand for the dollar will drop. If central banks reduce their dollar reserves, America's ability to finance its deficits will weaken. And if the world finds an alternative, the dollar's reserve currency status could be lost forever. What happens when the dollar collapses? If the dollar loses its global dominance, the U.S. will face an economic disaster unlike anything in its history. Imported goods will skyrocket in price. The U.S. relies on cheap foreign imports, but a weaker dollar means everything costs more. Debt payments will spiral. Without global demand for treasuries, the U.S. government will have to pay higher interest rates just to borrow money. Financial markets will panic. The stock market, housing market, and bond market all depend on a stable dollar. If that stability vanishes, so does confidence in the entire system. The point of no return. Losing the dollar's reserve status isn't just a financial crisis, it's the end of an era. For decades, America has been able to print money without immediate consequences because the world needed dollars. If that changes, the U.S. will have no easy way out. The last time a global reserve currency collapsed, it was the British pound after World War II. The British Empire never recovered. If the dollar falls, the same fate awaits the United States. This isn't speculation, it's history repeating itself. Every empire believed it was untouchable until it wasn't. Rome, the British Empire, the Soviet Union. They all collapsed, not in a single moment, but through years of economic mismanagement, political instability, and a failure to adapt. America's at that crossroads now. The difference is that this collapse won't happen in centuries. It could happen within a single presidential term. A path of discipline, cooperation, and responsible policy could slow the decline. A path of isolation, debt-fueled spending, and reckless tariffs will accelerate it. The people who will suffer the most, not the policymakers, not the billionaires. It will be ordinary Americans, the ones whose savings are wiped out, the ones paying $10 for a loaf of bread, the ones watching their retirements vanish, the ones who never saw it coming, but now you do. If you want to stay ahead of what happens next, subscribe to our channel because in the coming years, knowing what's happening won't just be interesting, it will be essential.